Hi, everyone. Recently, Michael O'Brien sent me a copy of Chaosium's new archival collection, Volume 1, the Stafford House campaign. I've always been interested in Greg Stafford as a person and as a game writer, and unfortunately, I never got to meet him before he passed away. So I thought a great thing to do would be to find out a little bit more about what Greg was like from people who knew him personally. And so what follows is my interview with Chaosium president Rick Meints, reflecting on the legacy of Greg and how he impacted people around him. Please enjoy.
Hi, everybody. I'm joined here with Chaosium President Rick Meints. Rick, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for chatting with me.
Absolutely. Now, Rick, the purpose of this meeting is that recently Chaosium released, and I have my copy of it here, the Stafford House campaign, which is a collection of letters. I think some of these are related to Worm's footnotes. Is that correct?
Well, you're asking the right person. I'm the one that was kind of my pet project in
Right?
between, other things. Managed to actually set aside some time on the nights and weekends just as extra because I love everything that's in it. So happy to talk about that product. Greg contributed to a number of early fanzines known as APAs, Amateur Press Association publications, basically where you'd mail in to the editor two, four, six, whatever even number of pages usually you had. They'd collate those into sets of other people's work as well, and then they'd send them out usually on a monthly basis. And so the early ones were in some rather rare APAs known as Alarms and Excursions and The Wild Hunt. Alarms and Excursions is still going, even though Greg contributed back in the 70s. The Wild Hunt, unfortunately, didn't survive, and
Yeah.
it's been out of print for over 20 years. But then he also, some of the later ones ended up being published in Worms Footnotes magazine, as you said.
Right. And I remember a time before the internet in which we had to do everything on paper and figure out how to communicate as a community. And I've been reading. I'm about halfway through it, and it's just fascinating to me to see what a game designer's mind was like in the early days of the hobby, what
Mhm.
a game master's mind was like trying to navigate maintaining a campaign with many people at one time. And it got me thinking, one of the things that really fascinates me about tabletop role-playing history is that the community tends to focus a lot on what people did in the gaming sphere. And there's nothing wrong with that. This is what the hobby is, right? But
Sure.
I'm also interested in who designers are as people because I think that there can be this unfair tendency for gamers to treat designers as if they're up on this ivory pedestal and are superhuman in some way, shape, or form. And I'm afraid that game designers' humanity gets lost in that. And so I wanted to interview you because Greg was a great person too. And I regret that I just got back into Chaosium gaming around 2017, right before he passed away. And so I unfortunately never got a chance to meet Greg or interact with him. And so I would love to hear some anecdotes or anything that you'd like the community to know about who Greg was as a person.
Well, I was very fortunate that I met Greg in 1994 at RuneQuest Con 1, and we became friends over the next several years, especially as he came to Europe to a number of smaller conventions that I was also attending. And I just started working with him on pet projects, and it grew from there to where I became a full-time Chaosium employee in 2015, and up until he passed away in 2018, we were fairly actively communicating with each other, be it phone calls, emails, and things like that. And also, I got to know him a fair bit as a person over those years because, especially at the smaller conventions, we're not talking anything remotely like Gen Con or Origins or anything
Right.
like that. These European conventions, Convulsion and Tentacles in particular, and the RuneQuest cons, of course, they were all 100, 200 people conventions where you had a lot of time to chat with people, get to know them, go out and have a meal, a pint at the pub, or a drink at the bar, or whatever else. And so that's where I really got to know Greg. And when I got involved with Chaosium, he would, well, especially before Gen Con, he'd stay at my house and we'd, have time with the wife and kids. And so it wasn't just all business with us. In some ways, I didn't work with Greg that much, even when I joined Chaosium, because Greg largely wanted to retire. And so, I was very honored when he offered me the job as president of Chaosium.
Awesome. Yeah, and I don't blame him at all for wanting to retire because you put in the good years, and you want to enjoy the time after. Excellent. Where do you see Greg's personality coming through in RuneQuest?
Well, we we have a saying about Greg, which is he had a natural 18 charisma, and because he was such a conversationalist, he was interested in other people. He wasn't just, oh, let me tell you all about me. He was happy to
Right.
ask you about yourself, your family, your interests, whether they were anything even remotely gaming related. And so that was one of the favorite things I liked about him. And I happy to talk about Greg and Glorantha, of course, but I did want to just have one short story because I mentioned he stayed at my house.
Sure.
One of the things that my wife misses is that when Greg would come to our house before Gen Con, is he would always spend a few hours helping sort out our fish tank, because Greg was a big fish person. He had a whole range of fish tanks, and even if he had a small apartment, he always had several fish tanks in it. And for a short time in California, he worked at a fish shop for a year or two, part time, I believe. And so whenever he came to our house, he would see our fish tank, which always needed some TLC,
Right.
and he was happy to chat about it with my wife and get the pH measuring kit out and test the water. They'd go to the local fish doctor's fish shop and pick out some new fish. And he was happy to do that. Even when we're doing all these preparations for Gen Con and all that, he always wanted to take some time to do that. And so, that's my wife's fondest memory of those hours she spent with him, just doing fish stuff and nothing to do with gaming at all.
And I think that that speaks loudly as about who he was as a person, because anybody who has attempted to maintain a fish tank knows that it is not an easy thing to do well. And
Yeah.
it's so easy for algae and other organisms to get
Yeah.
in there and mess up your environment and cloud it and everything. And so I find that to be a particularly, as a biologist myself, a particularly green flag for who a person is, that they would take the time to maintain a fish tank, because it's not easy.
Oh yeah, no, I think he had 6 or 8 of them in their house in Arcata, the last place he was living before he passed away. And I was always amazed at, just the variety of fish he had and all that when I visited there. And so, yeah, that's the fishy side of Greg.
About your game will vary, or
Yeah,
your Glorantha will vary.
yeah. And so, you were asking about Greg and his contribution to Glorantha. I mean, first and foremost, I believe, Greg is a storyteller. He always has been. And everything that he contributed to Glorantha in particular, especially the things that people remember the most, are the myths, the legends, the lore, the background. That's what he really cared about the most. He was happy to let other people like Steve Perrin, Warren James, Steve Henderson, let them create the mechanics of RuneQuest. He was happy to farm that out. And then he really added all the great, as I said, myths, legends, stories, lore, history that made the world of Glorantha come alive for that game system. And that
And
was,
people love a storyteller.
oh
That's
yeah.
how historically we as humans have passed on knowledge.
Mhm. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. I've been reading specific parts of the book here, and the particular section that was really interesting to me was how Greg sort of dealt with problems as they arose within the role-playing sphere. Because any of us who have played role-playing games know that managing and leading that sort of environment is not necessarily an easy thing, because everybody has different preferences. And so I've
Mhm.
been reading about him talking about, like, okay, so we've been having this issues with this, and I want you all to play, but at the same time, we're trying to construct this coherent campaign world. And I thought about doing this, and know that this isn't personal. And that it was just really amazing for me to read things that I've experienced as a GM in modern times. And I think it's important that as GMs work on their social interactions with people, that they're giving to their players and recognizing that this is all a mutualism that we're trying to work towards together. And I saw that he was really doing that in what he was typing out in the AMA publications, most likely on a typewriter.
Oh yeah, no, it was he largely he was a big typist. I mean, he must have been incredibly good at it. I didn't see him type a lot, but he definitely had a large volume of things that he was always working on and typing up. And for the APAs, it was definitely something where you had to type on stencils, and talking with Gestetner mimeograph machines and things like that. So it's technology most people have barely heard of, let alone used anymore.
Right.
And my favorite thing in the Stafford campaign log is the spot obvious skill that he came up with, especially because there are times when the party's not doing very well, they're missing all the clues, you're dropping a bunch of hints, they just don't seem to be getting it. And so the dumbest person in the party with the lowest int has the best chance of spotting something obvious, like, hey, that statue's alive. And because Greg, when he was role playing, one of his favorite characters was playing a gorilla, which had like an int of like 7 or 8 or something like that.
Sure.
And so he was often the person that got to spot the obvious. And so I just love that skill, because not only is it fun, but it just encourages more role playing. And so many of his contributions as a game designer were what would make the role playing storytelling aspect of the games all the better. And of course, the pinnacle of that would be what he did for Pendragon, with coming up with the passions and those type of things. That actually he created those for RuneQuest, and then it didn't really get into RuneQuest because of the whole transition from RuneQuest 2 to RuneQuest 3 in the 80s when it went over to Avalon Hill. And so a lot of those passions and things like that got put into Pendragon first, but they were originally written for RuneQuest.
And Pendragon 6 is highly anticipated. And that's an example of a game that, unfortunately, being from a small town, I had never heard of until recently. But I picked up the Great Pendragon campaign, and it's exactly what you're talking about. Like, what are the social and political and cultural dynamics that are happening within this quasi-historical world that
Mm-hmm.
Greg spent so much time uh, putting beauty into? And so I'm highly anticipating Pendragon 6th edition, and it's for the sorts of things that you're mentioning. Mechanics are the least interesting thing for me about role-playing games, and playing a flawed character is always the most fun thing to do in a role-playing game. And I love introducing role players to the concept of, well, what if you play a character who's bad at things, and what can that unlock for interesting storytelling?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely agree with that.
Wonderful. Um, what's your favorite uh, piece of wisdom that you might remember that Greg would give out to people? In your recent Out of the Suitcase, you had mentioned your conversation with the president of Avalon Hill and how you had unintentionally insulted the president of Avalon Hill. And
Sure.
Greg's response was, wow, that was gutsy, or, something to the
Well
equivalent.
done. I mean, he wasn't getting along with the dots by that time. I didn't know that because I had just met Greg that day when he told me, well, that was cool. And it wasn't so much a conversation with Eric Dodd. It was more, he asked me a question. I
Uh-huh.
just gave him an off the cuff, not really thinking about
Right.
an answer, not knowing who he was. And when he was just shocked at my answer, I just, kind of like scurried away. It wasn't like we were chatting and then, so, oh,
And
your kid's ugly kind of thing. But yeah, it
thanks for
was.
clarifying that, because I wasn't meaning to paint it like you had deliberately done it or something like
Sure.
that.
It was me being, a smart aleck, which I
Right.
tend to do more then back in the 90s than I do now.
Right.
But it was a great opportunity that I got to chat with Greg for over an hour, and he was very generous with his time. Once again, it was a smaller 150, 200 person convention. And so it was easier to get a bunch of his time. He wasn't on such a heavy track of things. He wasn't running a booth. He wasn't over scheduled, so we had time in between things to just get to know people and chat with them. And I was lucky I got to be one of those people. He he was happy to chat about almost anything. I He obviously would give advice if asked, but he usually didn't volunteer it. It wasn't like he was going around saying, "Hey, Sonny, let me tell you about life and
Right.
let me tell you what you need to know and all this." He would just, like I said, he was interested in whoever he was talking to and finding out about them, happy to hear their story, and would encourage you, usually whatever your passions were, for you to follow them. That's the overall biggest truth I could think about when Greg was talking with other people, is he was always encouraging you to be yourself, follow your passions, follow your interests. He liked it if you wrote your own material, because he was often pinned down by a number of people who were happy to pick apart, in a good way, whatever he had written. Like, oh, let's sit down and talk about this thing you wrote in the Entacosiad, which is, deep Gloranthan lore and not as easily approaching as a lot of other things that he wrote. Not to pick on it, but it was made for the Gloranthan scholars that really got into the deep end of the lore and mythology. And they would happily, pick at that. And Greg would just say, what are you writing these days? And what are you contributing to Glorantha? He wanted a lot of other people to contribute to whatever he was working on. It wasn't just his thing and enjoy what I wrote. It was always enjoying what other people added to it. And he'd give honest feedback. Sometimes he would say, well, it's not my take, but please enjoy your take. It was never a right or wrong. It was just, well, here's how I see it versus how you see it. And they didn't have to line up. That was never a big deal for him.
Was Greg aware of the plans for the Johnstown Compendium before he passed?
Oh, I believe he was. I know he would have loved it.
Sure.
And because he was always happy, especially back in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of fans that were publishing things. Like, I got involved with Tales of the Reaching Moon magazine.
Sure.
There was Trade Talk magazine, which I also helped with for a few issues. And Greg would contribute to all of these things. He would happily send an article or his take on things, grab something that he had written and maybe, spiffy it up just a little bit for the issue and round it out with some more information. And he was always happy to contribute to those things. And so I think the Johnstown Compendium is just a natural extension of supporting the fan community. And I don't remember his opinion on it in particular. The timeline's a little bit blurry about when we launched it versus when he passed away. I mean, he was active right up until he passed away. And it was such a big shock that, he just all of a sudden, Greg's gone.
Yeah.
But he would have loved it. That's for sure.
Yeah, and it really touches me personally, because a part of what I do in my work, I'm in teacher education. That is a lot of what we do in training new teachers. Is you need to follow your own passion. You need to be your own teacher. You shouldn't be trying to emulate a teacher. You should craft who you think you are and how you can contribute to the world. And of course, that comes through with Greg in all sorts of ways. Not only the passion mechanic in Pendragon, but also him just respecting whatever anybody is passionate about. And I particularly appreciate that, because I will listen to anybody talk about anything that they're passionate about, whether it is personally interesting to me or not. The passion is what is interesting to me.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Greg, thank you so much for the interview. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to put a link down below in the comments to this first volume of the Stafford Collection. Can you let us know what might be next for the Stafford Collection, or is that something that is still embargoed?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about it if I knew what it was. I haven't picked the next topic. I did that one first because I came across a folder that had all of his Son of Sartar write-ups in it. And I also found his Pharaoh's Gazette. And so I kind of had a collated set of these things. I'm like, what can I do with these? And so I scanned them in, because we're scanning in a lot of Greg's paper, notes, logs, whatever, just because we want to, preserve it. We don't want to be
Yeah,
relying on, this is the only paper copy we have. And
right.
so I've been scanning a lot of things in, and then those I OCR'd and cleaned up and got into into the final product you see, because it was easy. But what I'm going to do next with that type of thing, since it's kind of it's not about me at all, but it's just
Right.
I'm the only one working on this type of stuff.
Sure.
I don't know when we'll do another one. I certainly want to do another one. I would imagine I'll just be going through a stack of folders, scanning things and all. But whew, this is volume 2.
Sure.
I kind of like to think that Greg will kind of reach out, tap me on the shoulder, and kind of say, "Hey, Rick, do this next," and it'll
Absolutely.
just kind of pop up. Because one thing that a lot of people will probably mention about Greg is they still feel his presence. I do. I certainly, you know, at various times, like with the OGL and the recent problems with that, we said, this is something that Greg would totally jump into. He was one of the founding members of the Game Manufacturers Association, GAMA. He very
Yeah.
much believed in the industry as a community. It was a small community. He wanted to foster it. He felt that we should be helping each other and we're not really competitors. And so that was one of those moments like, yeah, Greg was talking to us about how this was something that we definitely wanted to get involved in, because he would have definitely personally gotten involved in it if
Awesome.
he would have been there in person at the time.
Yeah,
And so
that's
I'm
great.
sure Greg will point us in the direction of what volume 2 will be. I honestly don't know what it is right now.
And there's no rush because I just like that you're open to the fact of having a diversity of products, that we have RPG history, and then we have all the wonderful, great modern products that Chaosium is working on. And I want gamers out there to know that it's all good. It's all a question of what particular thing you want to read at any given time, and follow what your interests are. Thank you,
So,
Rick, so much for being here. And I'm going to have a lot more great stuff coming out on RPG Imaginings. And I am very excited to talk to Rick Meints, president of Chaosium. Thank you, Rick.
oh, my pleasure. I hope we do it again sometime.